Your phone rings, unknown number, and suddenly your heart drops, your stomach tightens, and you watch it ring and ring and ring until it finally stops. Then you exhale. If that sounds familiar, you're not dramatic, you're not antisocial. And according to psychology, your brain might actually be processing communication completely differently than the people who wonder why you never pick up. Stay with me, because what I'm about to explain will finally make sense of why a simple phone call feels like an ambush. If you're someone who sees a phone call and immediately thinks this could have been a text, welcome, you're about to feel very understood. Today we're breaking down the psychology of people who hate phone calls, the ones who let it go to voicemail, then text back "what's up?" The ones society calls rude, but neuroscience calls wired differently. And no, it's not just a Gen Z thing. Though if you were born after 1995, this is probably going to hit harder than most. Here's what nobody explains about phone calls. When you're texting, your brain has time. Time to read, time to process, time to think of a response, time to delete that response and write something better. But a phone call, that's real-time processing with zero buffer. Psychologists call this synchronous communication. Both people must process, respond, and react simultaneously. For some brains, that's natural. For others, it's overwhelming. Here's where it gets interesting. Research from the University of Essex found that people who prefer texting over calling often score higher in something called need for cognition. They like to think before they speak. They want their words to be precise. A phone call forces them to be spontaneous, and spontaneous feels unsafe. But wait, it gets deeper. Phone calls remove all visual cues. You can't see facial expressions. You can't read body language. You're flying blind, trying to interpret tone from voice alone. For people with even mild social anxiety, that ambiguity is exhausting. Your brain is working overtime trying to decode. Are they annoyed? Was that sarcasm? Did I say something wrong? Why did they pause? And all of this is happening in real time while you're also supposed to be forming intelligent responses. No wonder your nervous system treats it like a threat. Let's talk about what's actually happening in your body when the phone rings. For people who hate phone calls, that ringtone doesn't just signal someone wants to talk. It signals unexpected social demand incoming. And your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, responds accordingly. Studies show that phone anxiety activates the same stress response as other social threats. Cortisol rises, heart rate increases. Some people even experience mild fight-or-flight activation. And here's the kicker. The anticipation is often worse than the actual call. Researchers at the University of Chicago found that people who avoid phone calls often overestimate how awkward the conversation will be. The fear of the call is bigger than the call itself. But knowing that doesn't make the phone ring any less terrifying, does it? Because here's what's really happening. Your brain has learned, probably through past experiences, that phone calls carry risk. Maybe you were put on the spot once. Maybe you said something embarrassing. Maybe you grew up in a household where phone calls meant bad news. Whatever the origin, your brain now flags phone calls as potentially dangerous, and your body responds before your logical mind can catch up. You're not being dramatic. Now, before the comment section says this is just a young people problem, let me hit you with some data. A 2023 study found that 76% of millennials experience anxiety when their phone rings. For Gen Z, that number jumps to 88%. But here's what's interesting. It's not because younger generations are weaker or too dependent on technology. It's because they grew up with asynchronous communication as the default. Think about it. If you were born after 1995, your primary form of communication has always been text-based, messaging, DMs, comments, even voice notes, which still give you time to think before sending. Phone calls aren't normal to younger generations. They're an interruption, an intrusion, a violation of the unspoken social contract that says text me first to ask if you can call. And that's not entitlement. That's simply a different communication norm. Older generations grew up where phone calls were the only option. The phone rang, you answered. No caller ID, no voicemail, no choice. But now there is a choice, and millions of people are choosing not to answer, not because they're rude, but because their brains were shaped by a different communication landscape. Now, I'm not saying phone calls are bad. They're not. For some conversations, voice is better. Nuance, emotion, complex topics. Sometimes texting creates more misunderstanding than it solves. And some people genuinely love phone calls. They feel more connected, more personal, more real. Neither preference is wrong. They're just different. But if you're someone who dreads that ringtone, I want you to understand, there's nothing broken about you. Your brain just processes communication differently. Here's something that might surprise you. People who hate phone calls often have traits that are actually advantageous. They tend to be more thoughtful communicators. They choose their words carefully. They think before they speak rather than just filling silence with noise. A study in the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication found that people who prefer text-based communication often score higher in written emotional intelligence. They're better at crafting messages that land correctly. They also tend to be better listeners in person because they're not performing. They're not trying to fill awkward silences. They're actually present. And here's an interesting one. People who avoid phone calls often have stronger boundaries. They don't feel obligated to be available 24/7. They understand that their time and energy are valuable, and they protect them. That's not antisocial, that's self-aware. But I want to be honest about something. For some people, avoiding phone calls isn't just a preference, it's avoidance. Maybe the anxiety has grown so big that it's affecting relationships. Maybe you've missed important opportunities because you couldn't bring yourself to dial. Maybe the fear has become a cage rather than a quirk. If phone avoidance is causing real problems in your life, that's worth looking at. Not because something's wrong with you, but because anxiety that controls your choices deserves attention. There's a difference between I prefer texting and I can't make myself call even when I need to. One is preference, the other might be worth talking to someone about. Here's the bigger picture. We're living through a massive shift in how humans communicate. For thousands of years, all communication was real-time, face-to-face, voice-to-voice, no delete button, no time to think. And then, in just one generation, everything changed. Now we have the luxury of asynchronous connection. We can be thoughtful, we can edit, we can respond when we're ready, not when we're ambushed. And some people's brains have adapted to that new reality faster than others. Phone calls feel invasive to many people because, in a world of scheduled messages and chosen interactions, they are invasive. They demand immediate presence without permission. That doesn't make phone calls evil, but it does explain why so many people have started to resist them. You're not antisocial. You're not rude. You're just living in a world that now offers you a choice your parents never had. And you're choosing to communicate on your own terms. So the next time your phone rings and you feel that familiar dread, remember this: your brain isn't broken. It's just built for a different kind of connection. You're not avoiding people. You're protecting your mental bandwidth. You're not being rude. You're being honest about how you communicate best. And in a world that's constantly demanding your attention, choosing how you give it might be one of the healthiest things you can do. If this explains something you felt but couldn't put into words, you're probably going to relate to why some people overthink everything, and why that constant mental loop might actually be a hidden strength. Click here to find out if your brain never stops because it's broken, or because it's brilliant,